Hello, and welcome to LabGab, a live stream variety show that showcases events, destinations, and different talents across Second Life. I'm your host, Strawberry Linden. Today on our show, I'm very excited because we have the founder of Second Life, co founder of High Fidelity, and everybody's not so secret crush, Philip Rosedale. Welcome to the show, Philip.
Well, I'm blushing. I'm blushing, but you can't see that because I'm digital.
Well, I mean, your
Nice to
cheeks
be
look a
here.
little red. It's really nice to have you, and I do want to thank you for taking the time to do this. And before we actually get into all the virtual world questions, I wanted to know how you're doing. How's your family? I know it's crazy times, so let us know how you're doing.
Isn't this the strangest time that any of us have ever seen? I mean,
Absolutely.
you know, I'm older now, or I'm older than some, and I would still say, boy, oh boy, this is the craziest stuff that we've ever seen. I love the Saturday Night Live skit where Brad Pitt played Dr. Fauci,
That was so good.
and he said, I thought it really summed it all up. He said, "It's not a good thing if a miracle is Plan A."
Right.
Thought that really captured the horror and complexity of it. As someone who really loves complexity and adventure and things changing and challenges and stuff, I would still say I've had about enough of this drink for a while.
Yeah, very true. Well, I'm glad you're okay
But
and your
we're all
family's
fine.
good.
We're in San Francisco and we're just fine. Yeah, thank you for
That's
asking.
great. So, a question many in the community are dying to know, do you still log in to Second Life, which obviously you do? And if so, what communities and experiences do you enjoy exploring?
I most recently, I think, was hanging out in some of that very beautiful new, I don't know if they're called Linden homes now or something, but
Yes.
it was really beautiful. I ran into a few people there, and I remember sitting on somebody's dock and talking to them. I do log
Oh,
in. I love it. I have to admit, I kind of have fun being the founder, and so I'll kind of rock around and let people slowly figure out who I am. As you know, as you can see here, and maybe those watching, my name is not Philip Linden.
right.
I have the secretive name Philip Rosedale, but it's always kind of fun to show up somewhere because the people that have, of course, been in Second Life for a long time will look at I'll come up and I'll have this fun moment, where I'll walk into somewhere where there's people, and I do like music, and I like going into places where there's a bunch of people chatting. I mean, probably like we all do,
Hmm.
and I'll go in and somebody will say, "Hey, who are you?" And I'll say, "I'm the founder." And they'll say, "Oh, you are not the founder. That's nonsense." And then I'll say, "Well, let's just keep talking and just, kind of give it a minute." And
Right.
and somebody will say, "Oh my goodness," and they'll see my last name, and they'll know, well, it's a
And they can also Google.
yeah. Well, I mean, they'll see the last name and they'll be like, "Well, you can't just have the last name Rosedale," and it's like
Right.
I have to admit, it's kind of fun to do that, and it gives me great pleasure to
It
kind
must
of
be a little
almost
surreal.
like maybe I'm like Bill Murray. I want to be like Bill Murray, like with those Bill Murray experiences. I'd like
Yeah.
to have that be the case. I try to give everybody as much happiness as I can, like Bill
Oh.
Murray does.
So are you
Carry my rose,
surprised?
as you can see.
Yeah. Are you surprised that Second Life is still around 20 years after founding Linden Lab?
Are you kidding me? I'm not surprised at all.
No?
It is interesting how we have reached this size of the community and that it's stayed the same. Actually, I mean, most things change, right?
Right.
Most things in life, whether it's politics or tides or people or whatever, most things change. Second Life is so fascinating because it's like a standing wave. It does have a changing community. It has people coming into it and leaving it.
Yeah.
Um, but it's stayed like this big and the same size. So it's really quite. I find that fascinating. But no, I'm not surprised. I mean, I was trying to build the world that we're all going to live in someday. I mean, I've been working on that all my life. I mean, yeah, my perspectives about it, I think, have changed as I've grown and learned.
Mhm.
Grown personally, grown, I guess, technically, and as a leader. A lot of my thoughts about it have changed, but I still do feel that we humans get the chance to build new worlds now, and that those worlds are becoming increasingly sophisticated as Second Life and others now demonstrates. Look how far ahead of our time we were. I
Yeah.
mean, Second Life is still just, it's crazy that there's so many things that Second Life can do that still have not been replicated. after almost 20 years of work.
Yeah, so true. So let's talk about your avatar a little bit. Your avatar has become very well known and perhaps even iconic. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired you to create this unique look in Second Life? And I think you've had this from the starting, haven't you?
I have. You know, for those who know Andrew Linden, he still works with me at High Fidelity.
Oh,
Andrew is a man that I went to college with, studied physics together with Andrew. And
oh.
I point out Andrew because I'll tell you why. We had a contest when we first got Avatar
Mhm.
editing working. And of course, it wasn't with like flexies and things like that. This was sort of the first earliest point at which you could like Photoshop the skin and you could put a few clothing layers and stuff. And you could do attachments. Yeah, you could do attachments. So you could do hats and things like that. And we had a contest internally. We were probably maybe 15 of us or something at the time. And we had this contest and we said, well we're going to vote. Everybody's going to make the craziest avatar they can make. Everybody's going to spend all day making an avatar. And then we're going to vote and we're going to buy dinner for somebody. Whoever has best avatar, we're going to buy him dinner. You know, in San Francisco. Where
Did you
this was back
win?
in the days. Back in the days when you could go to dinner. No, I knew I wasn't going to see
Hmm.
because we had so many people, even at that time, just as Linden Lab is today. We had so many people that had great artistic skills. You know, like I
Right.
did not visually. You know, I'm not a visual artist, and I didn't even know how to use Photoshop. And so the first thing I was like, well, the only thing I can go for is shock value here. You know, like I'm not going to win, but I need to just be out there a little bit. And so the first thing I did was I found some pants, you know, more or less these pants, although I think they've been subtly upgraded over the years. But I found some pants and I figured out Photoshop and I was like, well, I can spray paint the crotch out of these pants and make them into like chaps or something, and that'll be crazy. And and so I did that, and maybe I found this shirt with the Stone Stir, the Rocky Horror shirt, and I don't know if I did the tattoo at that time or not, but I basically made my avatar with spiky hair and kind of yellow eyes and this sort of handlebar, chops and the whole thing. And so something pretty much like this, I presented and totally lost at the end of the day. It was Andrew who had made himself into a kind of a Leviathan. He was this kind of uh, he probably still has the avatar too. He had this wonderful sort of marbleized avatar, and I thought that was fantastic. He was the one for whom we bought dinner. Um,
Oh,
but this, as you said, I made this kind of just playful, almost kind of silly, person who was just kind of fun. What I could do in a couple hours,
yeah.
and I never changed it. And that identity became, both, as you say, iconic and kind of part of me. And so, yeah, I've never been inclined to change it. I'm sure some of that is because I'm the founder and I am a known sort of a public person or whatever, but it still is an interesting inquisition into identity.
It
Why
is
did
your
I make those
identity.
choices?
So why do
Why
you
did I make
think,
myself this kind of cowboy character?
but why do you think that crafting one's own identity is so important in Second Life?
Well, of course, that's a subject that people have written
Yeah,
PhD dissertations about. But I mean, because we can, right? I mean, uh, there is sufficient creative range, right? I
yeah,
mean, I always thought when we built the avatar systems at the outset that the thing that mattered most was that the combinatorial possibilities were sufficiently infinite that everybody could find their own look. That was the sort of thing that
right.
drove us with the sliders and whatnot at the very beginning. I did a lot of math, as is my tendency. I did a lot of math to kind of say, well, how many different avatars could you make with this system? And even without attachments, the number was really a lot. And then, of course, as we've added all these wonderful capabilities that you kind of demonstrate with your avatar and that we sort of have in this room around us here, we've added all these different capabilities. We just piled on. But I think the fact that you knew you could really do something that was uniquely you, and of course the fact that you for the first time in human experience kind of had the ability to sculpt yourself basically with your own skills and hands. Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't be delighted by that?
I think that's pretty much the appeal of SL in recent days anyways when it comes to avatar identity, especially compared to things going on with Facebook and so forth. So, yeah. definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that stuff obviously for days. You'd
Yeah,
run out of coffee and stuff, but yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways of creating identity.
I know.
One of them is to allow a deep and sophisticated kind of manipulation of the pixels that represent you. I think we're going to find there are other ways too. You know, like over at High Fidelity, we're doing something that's just very high quality audio and nothing else. And that's kind of an interesting experience. Not even 3D, it's 2D with high quality audio. So um, is that you? You know, like
Yeah.
what does that allow? So I think there are still important investigations ongoing that I hope we can continue to do um, as an industry, I guess, around identity. But yeah, Second Life is still a real line in the sand, I guess, or whatever you'd call it.
So let's go back to the beginning of Linden Lab and Second Life. Can you share some stories about the origins of Second Life and tell us what inspired you to create Linden Lab and eventually SL?
Sure. Well, I was born at just the right time for using computers over the internet. I often say,
Right,
like, if you look at somebody like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, see, they're 10 years or 15 years, whatever it is, they're a bit older than I am. And
right.
so for them, but they were also like engineers and tinkerers and builders.
Hmm.
So for them, the magical thing that they got to discover as, say, a 12-year-old or whatever was the computer itself. The idea that you could make a personal computer, and that idea was staggering. In
Yeah,
the, say, mid 1970s, right?
yeah,
The idea that you could make a personal computer was so radical. And I got that too as a kid. The idea of just programming computers was really cool. But you see, for me, I was younger, and so I was the next generation. And so the moment for me was the rise of uh, the internet
right.
as a vast network of connected computers. And so from as early as I can remember, from high school and earlier when I was programming, I was always like, hey, we got to network these computers together and create a space that is some kind of a place that people
Okay.
can build things in. And so I always wanted to do that. I started working on it experimentally in the 90s in a number of ways, both playing around with hardware for immersion and also thinking about networking.
Hmm.
But in 1995 or 1994, when the internet really took off, and when I was starting a lot of entrepreneurial stuff, like I had my own little company that I had started when I was in high school. Um, I didn't feel like the internet, and I was totally right. I didn't feel like the internet was fast enough yet, or graphics were good enough on computers to do something like this, like Second Life.
Yeah,
But
that's
in
when we had dial-up.
1999, yeah, that's when we
Yeah,
still had dial up.
yeah.
We all did. The people next to me in San Francisco, where my little office was,
Hmm.
had big stacks, I mean, big stacks, like 3 and 4 feet tall, of modems with phone lines plugged into
I
them
remember
because
that.
they were an ISP. They were one of the first service providers in San Francisco.
Right.
So, yeah, so I looked at that and I said, I want to build Second Life. I want to build this place that I'm dreaming of, but it's crazy talk to try to do it in 1994, 1995. So instead, I ended up working on video compression in 95, and I built a little video compression product. And I put it online, and maybe 10,000 people downloaded it or something. And it got the attention of Rob Glazer over at Real Networks, which at that
Right.
time was Progressive Networks and was a very small company. And they were sending audio over the internet, and they wanted to send video. And so Rob acquired myself and my friend, who the two of us were the ones working on this, and I went up there. And so for 3.5 years, I had this detour where I worked on sending audio and video over the internet. And I learned something about engineering management and things like that, which was
Hmm.
great. In 1999, everything changed, which was NVIDIA released the GeForce 2 chip. And
Oh,
Dell and Gateway, whoever those other ones were back then, they started putting that chip in their PCs. Now, but this is before laptops, if you believe that. Crazy. I mean,
yeah.
before really the wide, and before Wi Fi, in fact. But in 1999, you had people buying PCs that had these GeForce chips in them that could do graphics and pretty good graphics. And so that was the big motivator. And then, like you said, the second thing that happened was, at least in the cities, everybody started switching to broadband.
Right.
Cable modems and whatever it was, fiber, not fiber, but DSL back then.
Yeah.
So I was at Real Networks at the time, and I said, I got to leave. I literally went to my team and I was the CTO of Real at that point, and
Oh,
we were big. We had gone public and we were close to 1,000 people. And I said, I got to go. I got to work on this crazy thing. And so I left and I returned to San Francisco. And in late 1999, I found this warehouse in, Hayes Valley, and moved into it. And then Andrew joined me a couple of months later. Uh, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I started working on this idea of building a place.
so Andrew's always been there.
Yeah, and he's still with me now. It's fabulous. And of course, we all stay in touch. I mean, all
Yeah,
the early Lindens are still in pretty good touch, and a couple of them are still at Linden, which is
right, they
cool.
are, yeah. So there are rumors that you originally were focusing on virtual reality with a prototype hardware device called the rig. Is that
Oh
true?
yes,
And if so, what
absolutely.
happened? What happened to the rig?
So Andrew and I moved into that warehouse in part because it had a garage on the bottom with a roll-up door, and
Oh,
we could bring quite a range of equipment into that garage, and that is just what we did. So we got a milling machine and drill presses and a bunch of equipment. And the reason was, as you say, I had had an idea that I wrote down in a notebook in 1993. Now, this is before head-mounted displays, right?
hmm
It wasn't before them. They were around, but they were like $30,000. So, like, nobody in their right mind would build a product around them, and nobody could even afford them, so you couldn't even try them. Although, as a side note, I used to wait in line at conventions and put these things on because I was such a nut, like Palmer Luckey or something, about VR, that I would go to like military conventions where they had gear like that. Like I remember
hmm
San Diego, which is where I grew up, it's a military town. I'd go to these like conventions so that I could just put on whatever the latest very, very expensive VR headset was. But anyway, I knew those things, but I was driven by this incredible passion to build some sort of a consumer accessible, magical world. And so one of the things I had thought about a lot, through high school and in college was, well, how could you do that? How could you do that? I used to keep myself up at night thinking, basically, the displays are these big, heavy things. Remember back then they were cathode ray tubes. They weren't even LCD.
Wow.
So if you had to display information and put it in front of somebody's eyes, you actually had to do it for the most part, if you were going to do it cheaply, you had to do it with a TV set, which weighed 50 pounds. So
Goodness.
I kept thinking, well, wait a second, how could I use like 3 TV sets around me like a mask, so that I had a full field of view and I could see things in a virtual world, given that these suckers are heavy.
Yeah.
And of course, I thought, like everybody else, I thought, well, I'll make some giant robot that holds this thing in front of my face. But I mean, that's just total silliness, right? So one night I was thinking about this and I suddenly had this realization. I said, wait a second. What if you didn't let me move at all? What if you sort of immobilized me in some terrifying, Clockwork Orange sort of way? But you had a device that could tell that I was trying to, say, turn my head to the left and the right, right? Like if you imagine holding somebody's chin in your hand, right?
hmm
If they try to move to the left or the right, well, they're going to put force on your hand, right?
Right.
Now, if you do that with a piece of metal and you put a thing called a strain gauge on it, you can tell that somebody's trying to turn their head even though they're not able to, okay?
Okay.
So what we did was we stuck your head in front of a monitor. This is what Andrew and I built over that first 6 months or so. We sat you in a chair and basically sort of strapped you into it, put these monitors in front of you, and when you tried to turn your head, the computer would detect how much you were trying to turn your head, and it would turn your head. In other words, it would change the view that was on the monitors.
Oh, wow.
You
This
know
is
that
like
experience you have?
early days VR. It's
It
crazy.
was crazy. And the thing was, it totally worked.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't necessarily something that could be practically turned into a consumer device, although I still wonder about that, by the way. I think it could. But it was so remarkable as a sensation. You know what it was like? You know that experience when you're parked, you're at a stoplight and the other
hmm
car moves and you think you're rolling back or
Yes.
whatever, and
Yes.
then you jam on the brake
Yeah.
because you literally feel yourself in motion.
Yeah.
It felt like that. People would try it out and then they'd just be like, okay, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. So you'd turn your head to the left, and it's so hard to describe, but you can imagine it. Your virtual head would turn and you'd be like, I am turning my head. Everything in your body would scream out and say, yeah, you're freely moving your head. And then we did the same thing with your hands and your feet.
Wow.
So you could actually will yourself to bring your hands up in front of your face. And even though your real hands weren't moving, they were basically holding on to kind of handlebars, basically, if you imagine that. And the handlebars would sense the forces. And you'd bring your hands up and they'd come up. And so we built that thing called the rig. And we used it as part of, I think, convincing our earliest brave investors that what we were doing made sense. So we never productized it. We started working on the software shortly thereafter,
Hmm.
probably actually in the beginning of, in the earliest part of like the year 2000. We recognized that there was also a really big problem associated with the databases and the simulation of the world and the primitives.
Right.
And so we started working on the initial code that would become the simulators, basically, that make up Second Life. And so we
Wow.
became completely buried in that work, and we forgot about, well, we didn't forget about, but we stopped working on the rig.
Where's the rig now?
The rig is in different pieces. I've got some pieces. I've got some little pieces of it. Andrew's
Oh.
probably got a few pieces. We had some big. I can't find them. They're somewhere. Maybe they're at the Linden offices. We had these big pieces of structural aluminum called 8020 that were buried in footings of concrete that we made because this thing was such a monster. It had to be a big structure because it had to not move. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a milling machine or something. It had to be very heavy so that when you tried to move your hand, you were struggling against the skeleton, but the skeleton had to be strong enough because if you could feel it moving, obviously, well, if you could move it, you'd break the whole thing. And
Yeah.
so it had to be quite strong, much stronger than a person. So, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, well, let's talk about Linden Lab a little bit. What were the early days like at Linden Lab?
Well, it was very fun. I mean,
I
it
bet.
was so exciting to be sort of,
Honestly, it's still
inventing
fun.
something that nobody had seen. Well, great. I'm glad to hear that, and I'm not surprised. I have heard the same. Um, we were it was a combination of working on these really delightful ideas, that we could sort of simulate a world and we could watch the sunrise and set. I can remember that. The water, would have ripples in it. All those sort of ideas were so basic and so compelling to work on. And then at the same time, it was an exciting time in the computer industry where companies like Google were kind of questioning the status quo. There was a kind of
Right.
there was a sort of an enterprise software feeling that maybe Microsoft most gave off. I think they're
Yeah,
different now, but Microsoft at that time was kind of the big evil company,
right.
um, and we wanted to be different. We wanted to manage ourselves differently, and so we, from the very beginning, had a very, I guess you'd say, more bottom up as opposed to top down approach. I was always like, look, I'm the CEO and I'm an engineer, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. I want you to do it because it makes sense. I don't want you to do it because I told you so. Um, and so that drove a lot of our culture. And I think that, as you know, that
Hmm.
culture evolved to respect and uh, contain a lot of those ideas over the years. But it was very exciting that way. It was a very excited group of people that were seeing this stuff kind of come to life.
I think a lot of that culture is actually still there. Some in the community may not be familiar with this, but you led some corporate innovations that helped to shape and inform the culture at Linden Lab, such as the Love Machine, which I actually really love the Love Machine. And you also published the Tao of Linden, which we all still follow and it's still published. Can you speak a bit about both of those, which, how you
Sure.
ended up doing that?
The Love Machine was Corey and I, Corey Andreka, our CTO at that time, or
Hmm.
he probably had a different maybe role at that moment. I don't remember, but Corey and I were tossing around ideas about economies because Second Life had this economy, right? And the Love Machine was from about, I think it was from about 2005. So Second Life was actually up and running. So Second Life informed it, right?
Right.
So with Second Life, we knew we had uh, chat and we had money in the system and we had the ability to give people little digital things. And
Hmm.
so I think that kind of shaped some of our thinking. And the thoughts I can remember is Corey and I were talking about a sort of a tipping machine where you could kind of kind of tip your coworkers, right? And
Right.
and then we were like, well, really, what really matters is that you describe in a sentence like what you're thankful for, or whatever it is you're doing. And so I remember at some point Corey and I were refining that idea, and then Corey went and like I think he wrote a prototype of it that weekend or something, and I said, well, we got to call this the Love Machine. That's just so great. I thought of that name, and I think it's like a '70s like funk band or something. But I was like, oh, the Love Machine. That's what we got to call it, the Love Machine. Everything's a machine around here. All these moving parts that comprise Second Life. So I was like, well, we got to call this thing the Love Machine, and you got to send people love. And that was before Twitter,
Yeah.
and so it was pretty cool. I mean, especially at the time, the idea that you just send a short message. Remember, this is before Slack too.
Yeah.
So we used the Love Machine in email. The thing that we prototyped was just a little form
Hmm.
that you would fill out that would just say strawberry, as the username, which is basically your email name, and
Hmm.
then what do you want to send? Thank you for having me on LabGap. That was a lot of fun. What a beautiful space, and
Yeah.
and you, as you know, and you'd send it, and it would go out, and it was timely. And also, we would, and I don't know how much Linden does this now, but we would put these big screens that had the last
Yes.
10 or 20 messages that have been sent. And we'd put them like near the kitchen or near the bathrooms or whatever, so that you'd be likely to encounter them all the time. So you'd get a kind of a good feeling for what was going on, as you know, just by reading the love that had been sent. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was
Well,
really fun.
I work remote, so I don't know if they have that in the office, but
Hmm.
you can see it on the site. And the Love Machine is just so wonderful. And it's just so great for morale to have your coworkers sending you love and, thanking each other. I just love that part of the culture of the company.
By the way, we turned it
Hmm.
into a product and we sold it to a few companies, and we
Oh,
still use it today. We've used it every day at High Fidelity for the whole time we've been in business, and we use it, I would say, probably just as much in a similar fashion to how Linden does. So, and other companies are actually starting to adopt that. There's a number of companies now that are doing identical or very similar things that allow you to send recognition in that way.
so what about the Tao of Linden? How did you guys come up with that?
The Tao of Linden was, if I remember, really written down first by Jinsu,
Hmm.
um, another famous Linden
Hmm.
over the years, and a very good friend of mine today. Um, it, Gene really took on basically writing down what he felt we were doing. I don't remember which elements of it I had like previously written. Probably choose your own work and no politics, which were things that I felt very strongly about at that time. But Gene really filled it in and made that first list of, I think, 7 things. Of course, the last one was a joke, might makes right,
Well,
which I thought was just wonderful. I don't know whether that's still there, but Gene thought it was particularly irreverent to include in the list something that wasn't in the list.
I think it's changed, but I could be wrong. So, okay,
Yeah.
my next question is, if you could do one thing differently when creating Second Life, what would it be and why?
Do you mean? Would you like me to answer first as to the product or to the company and its culture?
Let's do the company first.
Sure. I'm probably more sure. Maybe I have better answers than the product, so it's a good place to
Okay.
start. I think that I was really a rebel.
You still are.
I think I think everybody would agree with that. I
Hmm.
was a rebel, and I kind of like to shake things up, and so I loved the idea of building a work culture around it not being top-down management. Not telling people what to do. I just loved that idea, and but I think looking back, I was so aggressive about that idea that I made it into a kind of a monoculture
Hmm.
that was probably not a perfect fit for everybody. And I think, in work, in the world right now, we're talking a lot about inclusion and we're talking about diversity, and that is really a powerful conversation
Yeah.
and an important one. And I think that I had these wonderful ideas, but I think I forced them on everybody so uniformly. Like, for example, this idea of choose your own work, which was one of my first, crazy things. Nobody can tell you what to do. You have to pick what you want to do. Now, not everybody it was kind of, I used to, I jokingly at work, but I mean, it was just, I would say that famous Princess Bride line. What is it?
As you wish.
No, yeah, you're right. That's the most famous one, of course.
Okay.
That's wonderful. No, it was good work, Wesley.
All right.
Sleep well. I'll most likely kill you in the morning,
Yes.
which was the original Dread Pirate Roberts to Wesley. And we used to laugh about that, but I think the problem was like choose your own work kind of felt like that. I think sometimes like, hey, work on whatever you want to and know one thing. If it's not the right thing, we're not going to keep you. you and I think that's quite an ask. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think that everybody gets up in the morning and goes, I want to work at a company where they tell me to do whatever I want. I'll be evaluated on that. And if I'm not useful enough, I'll be, I won't get to stay around. Now, that's not how Linden really was. And it's not how, certainly not how it is today. But I think it kind of felt like that sometimes. Like and I wanted to be that person. Like I was the crazy, aspiring Dread Pirate Roberts, right? Like I wanted to have everything be incredibly high risk and on my shoulders, right?
Hmm.
But I think culturally, what I've what I've learned to respect as I've grown up is that while you definitely want to create a culture where some people can have it that way, you don't necessarily want to force, almost you don't want to uniformly force that behavior on everybody. So that's an example of something that I would have
Done differently.
I think Linden has done it differently after
Yeah.
me. So let me
Yeah.
say, I think it's been good that way. But I think that I would have even earlier said, okay, here are some alternative ways we can work together. Let's figure out, let's play with them. And I think I would have been respectful of and listening to some people saying, Philip, the way you want to do it with this incredibly high stakes poker stuff or internal markets or whatever, that's a bit much for me. I don't like that. And I would have said, okay, no problem. You know,
Yeah. Well, that's good. Okay. So the big question that everyone is probably waiting for me to ask you. As you know, Linden Lab recently announced that an agreement was signed for it to be acquired by an investment group led by Randy Waterfield and Brad Oberwager. While I know that you're not in a position to say anything specific about the terms of the deal, I wonder if you can share any thoughts about what you think it means for the future of Second Life. And also, I know that you know Brad personally and professionally for many years.
right. So you're right. While I certainly can't say much, what I can say is this: I've known Brad for a long time, and he has been just fascinated with and delighted by the stories of and the things that he had seen, about Second Life. And so he was always just so respectfully, um, like, man, I wish I had your job, or I wish I could work on something like that. Like he
Yeah,
always had this kind of approach to it. And then, of course, he's as I hope you've seen a little bit already. Um, he's just a wonderful, very capable, very smart, very adaptive, great listener person. And so when the opportunity came around, for him to become more involved in this way, I was delighted. And so what I think at a high level it means is that the spirit of and the excitement of and the things that make Second Life magical. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I think a lot of the things that are really wonderful about Second Life are 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 going to continue on and prosper and grow. I mean, I'm very excited about it.
that's good. So it's going to be good news, you feel.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm just delighted to see Second Life, continue on in under new management, I suppose. But I think that we're going to be very. I think we're all going to really enjoy this, and I'm looking forward to, being involved and hanging out in World and helping out wherever I can.
Well, me too. I feel the same. So now on to other things. Your career spans much more than just Second Life, of course. Prior to Linden Lab, you were a key executive, like you said before, at Real Networks. And so, can you tell us more about your work there and how that influenced your decision to form Linden Lab? I think actually you kind of covered that, but is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I got all the right training.
Hmm.
I had a wonderful opportunity to work for a remarkable boss who was really passionate about uh, not just building a big company, but doing something really amazing. As I mentioned, Real Networks was initially called Progressive Networks, and that was because
Right.
Rob wanted to use the ability to communicate with audio over the internet in some way, to be of service to people, and that was what he was inspired by, and I think speaking for Rob still is. So I think that it gave me that kind of like support that I could go after something that was really a passionate mission. So I think it really helped me that way. And then I got great experience, and I got lots of like relevant technical experience with stuff like video codecs and things like that I was able to apply to the design uh, of Second Life.
About a decade or so ago, you left Second Life Linden Lab to explore other entrepreneurial efforts. Can you tell us why you chose to move on at that time?
Well, we were growing so quickly then,
Yeah.
and I had always been a contrarian in my thinking about stuff. Like I said, I'd always been a rebel, and at the time, I felt like maybe I wasn't the right CEO. I was. We were a couple hundred people in that year. This is around 2009, 2008.
Hmm.
So at some point, I was always really hardcore. I remember uh, having conversations with my investors, some of my investors. We had some really remarkable investors that I'd be able to call on from time to time to ask things of. And I can remember asking this question, and saying to them, look, a lot of the day-to-day stuff of being the CEO of this kind of an undertaking, I don't know if that's what I want to do. I'm an inventor. I'm a tinkerer. So I had this crisis or question as to whether I was the right leader. And I was such a contrarian, that I was immediately like, well, if I have that instinct, I should just be fearless and replace myself and hire a new CEO. So I did this blog post, and I remember the company being like, we truly have a crazy leader here, yet again. So rather than conducting like a private search or having some lengthy, thing, I just did a blog post, and I said, I'm going to look for a new CEO. I want to find a new me. And Mark Kingdon sent me an email a few days later, I think, and he was like, I think it could be the right job for me. So it was just a really fascinating process where I just decided I wasn't, maybe there wasn't the right, didn't have the right set of capabilities for that job. We were growing so quickly. It was very exciting at that time. A lot of the early kind of legal and regulatory stuff was going on. You can imagine. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a wild roller coaster to be the boss. And
Yeah.
so I wasn't sure it was the right thing for me. And so that led me to replace myself and kind of wander the earth, and do a number of other things. And I think that experience was great. And I think Linden was just fine without me. I mean, I think the experience was a good one.
Well, now you're involved with High Fidelity. Can you share a bit about what High Fidelity is and how we can check it out? Actually, you gave me a tour once a few years ago.
I know, and
Is
you've
it
seen
different?
it's a totally different experience
Yeah.
now. But yeah. So from 2009, I left Linden,
Hmm.
and Ryan. Ryan Linden
Hmm.
left with me as one of my two co-founders of our new work of Love Machine, and which then became Coffee and Power, which kind of then became High Fidelity. So the way Coffee and Power became High Fidelity was we had done a number of interesting things together. We were about probably 12 people or something at that time. Now, sorry, this is about 2013, and I because I'm a tinkerer, I bought one of the very first chips that is a chip called an analog rate MEMS gyro. There's a lot of words for you.
Wow.
And that little tiny chip, which you could buy for $10 from SparkFun or somebody like that, was a tiny chip that for the first time could tell you which way it was turned, basically. So you had this little chip and you put it on a little board and you tipped it in the air and it could tell you exactly how it was turned. Now, nowadays that may seem easy, like my phone can do that, but this was in 2013. These chips that could do that had just come out, and they had just become inexpensive. And I got one of those chips and I hooked it up to an oscilloscope, and I started tilting it in my hands. I held it in my fingers and I tilted it while looking at the scope, which was basically telling me, the electrical output, how it was moving. So there was a line on the scope that was moving up and down as I tipped my hand left and right. And as soon as I saw that, I knew that the Oculus Rift was going to work.
Wow.
I knew that it was going to be possible to build a VR headset, as I mentioned, and you talked about with the rig.
Yeah.
I had been very passionate about these devices. And so when I saw that chip, I made a very aggressive move. And I basically said to everybody, we're gonna move to a completely new project. We're going to start working on VR again. We're going to go back into virtual worlds. And so High Fidelity was a company founded with at the dawn of, and before, it was like during the Kickstarter or something for the Oculus Rift. And so I made a guess that these headsets would work, which in retrospect, I was wrong. We're still too early, but
Yeah.
we can get to that later. But I made a guess that these headsets were going to be the way everybody did 3D, in a few years. And so I said, let's start building a whole new virtual world, which is designed from the very start to work with those headsets. Interestingly, Linden, around the same time, began thinking about some of its own projects in that regard, which,
Right.
as we know, was the kind of genesis of Sansar.
Sansar,
So
yeah.
anyway, that's what we worked on for 5-6 years. And then last year, we realized that the VR headsets weren't going to be the consumer entry point that we thought they were.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody debates this. I love debating it with people, and I do routinely, to talk about all this. And of course, it's anybody's guess exactly what will happen with VR hardware. But basically, I could talk about that for days too. But basically, we said, we've got to build something that doesn't rely on these VR headsets. As much as we've worked on it, we got to stop. And so we did something that is a really fun set of ninja moves over the last year or so. But where we ended up with today, and we actually built this before COVID, so it was crazy interesting that the timing there. But what
Yeah.
High Fidelity is today is we made it into, we decided to start with a different strategy, which was to build something that was 100% accessible to everybody, but that still delivered some kind of an amazing virtual world experience. And that's what we're doing right now. We're in the middle of that. But basically, at the beginning of this year, we got only the audio working. So it's kind of like, imagine, that experience people talk about called like dining in the dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a virtual world where you can move around because you can see yourself from the top down on a map, but you can't see anything, well, other than like a background. You can't see anybody, but you can hear them perfectly. And I mean really perfectly.
Yeah. The
So
voice is
basically,
insane,
yeah,
I heard.
as you know,
Yeah.
yeah. So High Fidelity is a radical leap in audio quality, and in particular, it perfectly spatializes in 3 dimensions where the sound is coming from. So of course, what that means, if you haven't experienced it, is you can close your eyes and you can point at where the person is. You can do that, by the way, at Second Life today with the voice that we're using, but
Okay.
it's not as good. What High Fidelity is it does that much better, and it does it with very high quality, so you can play music as easily as you can speak. And the other thing is that the delay, the time it takes for my voice to reach your ears,
Mm-hmm.
is very low. And so we built a system based on that, and that's what we have today. We have a kind of a beta where you can create a virtual space and invite a bunch of people into it. So in addition to it sounding really cool, it also, and this is one of the things that I think is in the future for Second Life as well, it also breaks through that barrier of how many people you can have in one place.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have hundreds of people in the same place. And we're about to release the ability to have thousands of people in
Oh,
the same
wow.
space. So we worked on 2 things. Fantastic audio quality. So you'd sit with somebody and you'd just be in love with the experience. If you sit in a group of 10 people or something like you do all the time in Second Life, you hear their voices and it's so warm and wonderful. There's a demo on our website at highfidelity.com. You can actually jump into a space that has about 65 people all talking, like kind of at a party. I mean, they're bots, but
Mm-hmm.
they have real voices. You'll get what I mean right away. You can just jump in there. It's one click. You don't have to sign up for an account or anything, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a shocking
I
acoustic
remember when you gave
experience.
me the tour 2 years ago, the sound quality was incredible. Like we were in World in High Fidelity, and you came right close to my right ear and said something, and then you went around. And I don't know if it's improved since then. That was, I think, a couple of years ago, or is
It
it
That was
similar?
the experience. It's about the same. So yeah, if you and just like you said, we do a thing that's called near field audio where I can whisper in your ear
Yes, it
and
was
I am
wild.
like in your head. I mean, you will just be like, "Oh my gosh, that's so, intimate." I mean, it's not,
Yeah,
something you do with people you know.
yeah,
But yeah, it's a remarkable experience, and we're evolving it rapidly with our well, we're a team of about 20 people now, so we're
20.
working away on that and having a lot of fun. And like I said, COVID happened, and
Right.
we don't you think? I mean, I think that COVID has kind of forced the entire world over the last 6 months or so to go through the same process of becoming virtual that we
Yes,
all chose to in Second
yes.
Life. I mean, how weird is that, right?
I
And so
actually have a question
everybody's
about that.
discovering it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's things are just completely different now, and I'm just wondering what the future holds. So what's next for High Fidelity? Do you have any other entrepreneurial endeavors that you want to share, and what do you
Well,
where do you see it going because of the pandemic?
some of it's a secret, but let me
Okay.
just say that first of all, we're going to work really hard to create super accessible, inclusive technology that can bring thousands of people into the same place. That's kind of
Nice.
where we think there's something exciting to be done and something that's, say, different than something like Second Life because, as we all know, to render a room like this with your beautiful hair and your tennis shoes with all their detail and the cats in the room and the
Yeah.
flickering candles and the I can see steam coming off the coffee.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. I'm
Yeah.
holding a rose that's pretty close to photorealistic. That's amazing. But you can't do that with modern technology, even with 2020 technology. You can't do that for 500 people at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, it's unfeasible. I mean, or it's very difficult. And there's this trade-off between the detail. And so, in Second Life, you can be in small groups of people with an extraordinary amount of detail if you have a fast PC.
Yeah.
Um, so I think one important direction is to say, how can we all, and I think there's roles for the Linden in this as well, how can we get more people in the same space so that they can communicate with each other and have an amazing experience and feel connected like we do in Second Life, um, but maybe take those numbers up. We got lots of other crazy ideas we're working on as well, and you'll see them in the
Well,
in the
I'm looking
months to
forward to it. I
come.
hope to get another tour.
Absolutely, I'd love to give you one.
So the concept of a social virtual world was so ahead of its time. And it feels like the pandemic has caused new respect and recognition, like you were saying, for the value and utility of shared virtual world and VR platforms. That must be so affirming for you. Has the pandemic caused you to have any shift in your vision for the future of virtual social networks?
On the one hand, it certainly is affirming. I feel
Yeah.
it's a wonderful that well, I feel like it's wonderful that I've been able to spend my career working on technology, which is now all the more useful. Like we now have more reasons, right?
Hmm.
We have a pandemic that forces us to interact digitally more. And so I've learned so much about how to do that right. And we all have, and Linden has. And I'm so glad that we're here. Like I'm so glad that we can be of service, that as High Fidelity and as Linden Lab, we can provide something for people that are now more forced, to
Yeah.
come into the digital domain. That said, as we all know, there are challenges with being digital, with crossing the divide,
Yeah.
like we've learned a lot. Like, what have we learned in the last 6 months as a human species, right? Well, one of the things we've learned is video's not as good as we thought it was.
For sure.
You know,
Yeah.
everybody was like, well, my goodness, I use FaceTime or I use Zoom or
Yeah.
I use Team. I'm just going to use video. And what we've discovered is, and of course, this doesn't surprise the designers at Linden or at High Fidelity, but what we've discovered is, There are some problems with that. There's some problems with just being on video conferences all day long. Your self-image is affected by looking at your self-view, where you're badly lit and you know not in makeup or whatever. There's this hypervigilance problem, or this physiological arousal problem, which is when you do the Brady Bunch thing with your team at your company, and you've got 9 or 20 people kind of looking straight at you as humans.
Yeah.
Although I dare say that would probably be the same as avatars too. But if people are just like staring straight at you, kind of pointing their noses at you, it arouses you. I'm using that term; it's a physiological term. Your heart speeds up. You get ready to maybe fight or run or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
you're aroused when somebody you don't know well is kind of staring right at you.
Right.
Um, and of course, video, the Zoom call or whatever, the Brady Bunch, sort of format of
Yeah.
that totally does that to you.
Yeah.
And so that's one of our advisors at High Fidelity is a researcher, and a brilliant, brilliant researcher named Jeremy Balanson, who has spent his life studying VR and avatars and how people interact. And he wrote something in the New York Times very early on in COVID that really did a good job of explaining what I'm perhaps badly explaining there, which is that video makes us extremely fatigued. It's just too much. And of course, sitting here as avatars is not fatiguing.
Yeah. It's actually
So,
fun
and
as
using the
avatars.
voice, using
Yeah.
only your voice, is provided the quality is reasonably good, is not fatiguing. So yeah, it's fun. So I think we're learning things. I do think there's a long way to go though. Like one of the things, I guess the flip side of that would be I'm struck by how difficult losing physical contact with people is,
Yeah.
and how the the virtual technologies don't yet capture all of that. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't make me not want to be near people or able to, you know,
You still need to be
walk into a
touched.
real room.
Yeah.
Yeah, shake somebody's hand, give them a
Right.
hug, right? Like I feel like we can give virtual hugs, but they're not real hugs. And I'm inspired to keep working on that. I'm as inspired as I've ever been to keep working on these things and keep trying to cross that distance.
Well, I look forward to seeing you do more of that. We're getting to the end of the hour. I know there are community questions coming in, but
Sure.
I know I'm not sure I can keep you for that long. Um, but I do want to say thank you, and I also want to give you an opportunity if there's something that you want to say to the viewers out there. There are quite a few people.
Gosh, I'm looking at my schedule right here too and seeing what I've got. Oh, I do have something at 11:30.
Right.
11:30 California time.
Hmm.
So I do need to go in a couple minutes. I mean, I could take one question, or I mean, I love um, I love sitting and talking to everybody in Second Life. So um, and I look forward to doing that more, in the coming months here.
Okay, well, there is one question that I thought was interesting
Sure.
by Martin Mooney. He's asking, looking ahead, how does Philip see the future of 3D worlds in general, for SL in particular, and technically? I think we have kind of covered that, but what do you
Yeah, I
feel
mean,
about the future of SL kind of thing?
I'd like to see this experience be a bit more accessible to more people. I think we're getting technologically to a point where we can like make this experience more accessible on more computers, or
User
maybe
friendly.
accessible on mobile, or yeah, and then of course user friendly.
Yeah.
Everybody says that we've got to make the interface better. I think that that's true. There have been a lot of good experiments in
Hmm.
that. I think it's hard, by the way. I think that
Yeah.
it's hard to drive yourself as an avatar through a real world while being a real person. Not just playing a shooter game, right, or something, but being a real person. I think that problem is, I'm not going to say irreducibly hard, but I would say that it's harder sometimes, as you know, and you know this too, Strawberry,
Hmm.
at work. It's sort of like everybody's saying, well, just make it easier. And
Yeah.
I tell you, I've been away from the company for a while. We have had so many people, and there have been so many products in the industry, right, that have tried to make it easier, and it's pretty hard.
Right.
Uh, there's not there's not really, there's still not a lot of products that demonstrate, right,
Hmm.
how to do the interface better or best for people in a virtual world. So I think improvements are going to be made there, though. Like I say, I'd love to see this experience be something that was a bit more accessible, so more people could have it, that
Yeah.
wanted to. Like it feels to me like the people for whom Second Life is a wonderful, inspiring, useful, helpful, educational thing
Hmm.
is larger than the subset of people who have the right equipment to do it right now, today,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would just
You're
kind
right.
of leave it at that.
Well, thank
Thank you.
you. It's 11:30. I don't want to keep you much longer. I know you have to go, but in closing, I wanted to say thank you, Philip. And I think I've said this to you before, but I really wanted you to know what an impact your work and your vision has had on thousands and millions of residents, including myself. It's completely changed my life for the better, and for that, you will forever be my not so secret crush. So thank you, Philip, from the bottom of my heart. And thank you for
Thank you.
taking the time to speak to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for bringing me on. I'm so happy to be here. It's wonderful. And thank you for all these great questions and the time, too. Take care.
Well, thank you to the viewers for watching. Keep an eye on the Second Life community blogs for future announcements about LabGab. And remember, stay safe, stay home, stay virtual. Bye, everyone.